In the shadowed halls of Thornfield Manor, where duty weighs heavier than desire, a duke's carefully orchestrated life is about to collide with an innocent soul who will challenge everything he believes about love, honor, and the price of nobility. What begins as a cold transaction between two powerful families will ignite into something far more dangerous than either could have imagined. But on their wedding night, one shocking revelation will change the course of their lives forever. If you're listening to this story, don't forget to click the like button, subscribe to the channel, and tell me in the comments which part of the world you're listening from. I want to know how far this story has traveled. The autumn rain drummed against the diamond-paned windows of Thornfield Manor as Alexander Blackwood, the 7th Duke of Ravenshollow, stood in his study reviewing the marriage contract that would seal his fate. At 28, he possessed the sharp features and commanding presence that had made the Blackwood name legendary across England's aristocratic circles. His dark hair, meticulously styled, caught the firelight as he read the terms that would bind him to a woman he had never met. "Lady Evangeline Ashworth," he murmured, testing the name on his tongue. The daughter of the Earl of Westmere, a family whose fortune in textile mills had recently elevated them to the highest echelons of society. The marriage would unite two of England's most influential houses, securing trade routes and political alliances that would benefit both families for generations. Alexander's fingers traced the elegant script detailing the dowry, a sum so substantial it would restore Thornfield's crumbling East Wing and fund his ambitious plans for modernizing the estate's agricultural operations. Yet, as he studied the contract, a familiar weight settled in his chest. At what point had his life become nothing more than a series of calculated transactions? His butler, Pemberton, entered with practiced silence. "Your Grace, the Ashworth carriage has been spotted approaching the gates." Alexander straightened his cravat and moved to the window. Through the rain-streaked glass, he watched an ornate carriage navigate the winding drive, its wheels splashing through puddles that reflected the grey October sky. Inside that carriage sat his future bride, a woman chosen not for love or compatibility, but for the strategic advantage her family's wealth would bring to his own. The Duke had heard whispers about Lady Evangeline at various social gatherings. She was described as quiet, well-educated, and possessed of a beauty that was more subtle than striking. Unlike the bold debutantes who typically vied for his attention at London balls, she seemed to prefer the shadows, speaking only when addressed and maintaining the demure composure expected of a proper lady. As the carriage drew closer, Alexander found himself wondering what thoughts occupied her mind during this journey to meet her intended husband. Did she harbor romantic dreams about their union, or had she, like him, resigned herself to the practical realities of aristocratic marriage? The very fact that he knew so little about her personality, her hopes or her fears, struck him as both typical and tragic. The marriage had been arranged by their fathers during a particularly profitable business dinner 6 months prior. Alexander remembered the evening clearly. Brandy, cigars, and the casual discussion of their children's futures as if they were discussing the purchase of prize horses. The Earl of Westmere had been eager to secure a ducal title for his daughter, while Alexander's father, before his death the previous spring, had been equally motivated by the Ashworth fortune. Now, as Alexander prepared to meet his bride-to-be for only the second time, their first encounter had been a brief, formal introduction at a London soirée, he couldn't shake the feeling that he was about to cage a bird that had never truly learned to fly. The irony wasn't lost on him that in securing his family's financial future, he might be sacrificing any chance of finding genuine happiness. The sound of carriage wheels on gravel grew louder, and Alexander moved away from the window. In less than a fortnight, he would stand before God and society, pledging his life to a woman who remained in every meaningful sense a beautiful stranger. What secrets lay hidden behind Lady Evangeline's carefully composed exterior, and would their wedding night reveal truths that neither of them was prepared to face? The grand ballroom of Thornfield Manor had been transformed into a glittering spectacle befitting the wedding celebration of a duke. Crystal chandeliers cast dancing shadows across walls adorned with centuries-old tapestries, while hundreds of England's most distinguished guests mingled beneath soaring ceilings painted with scenes of classical mythology. The October evening had brought with it a crisp clarity that seemed to sharpen every detail of the momentous occasion. Lady Evangeline Ashworth, now the Duchess of Ravenshollow, stood beside her new husband in the receiving line, her ivory silk gown catching the candlelight like captured moonbeams. The ceremony earlier that afternoon had proceeded with flawless precision, each ritual performed according to centuries of tradition. Yet, as she smiled graciously at the endless parade of well-wishers, Evangeline couldn't shake the sensation that she was watching her own life unfold from a great distance. Alexander, resplendent in his formal evening wear, played his part with the practiced ease of a man born to command attention. His responses to congratulations were perfectly measured, his posture impeccable, his smile never wavering. To the assembled guests, they appeared to be the very picture of aristocratic perfection, a union that would be whispered about in drawing rooms across England for years to come. "Your Grace," Lady Pemberton gushed as she approached, her ostrich feathers trembling with excitement. "What a magnificent celebration! The Duke appears absolutely devoted to his new bride." Evangeline inclined her head gracefully, though she noticed how Alexander's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly at the word devoted. They had exchanged perhaps a dozen meaningful conversations since their engagement, most of them focused on practical matters, household management, social obligations, the expectations that would govern their public appearances as husband and wife. As the evening progressed, Evangeline found herself studying her husband's interactions with their guests. She observed how his demeanor shifted subtly depending on his audience. Warmer with old family friends, more formal with political allies, almost cold when greeting certain members of London's newer aristocracy. It was a masterclass in social navigation, yet it left her wondering which version of Alexander, if any, represented his true self. The orchestra struck up a waltz, and Alexander offered his arm with ceremonial precision. "Shall we, Your Grace?" The title still felt foreign on her lips as she accepted his escort to the dance floor. As they moved together in perfect synchronization, the result of countless dancing lessons rather than natural harmony, Evangeline became acutely aware of the hundreds of eyes watching their every movement. This was their first dance as husband and wife, a moment that would be dissected and discussed in tomorrow's society papers. "You're performing admirably," Alexander murmured as they turned, his voice pitched low enough that only she could hear. "Mother would be pleased with how seamlessly you've adapted to your new role." The comment, clearly intended as a compliment, struck Evangeline with unexpected force. Was that all she was to him, a performer playing a role? She had harbored quiet hopes that their marriage might evolve into something resembling affection, perhaps even love. Her romantic heart, carefully hidden beneath layers of proper breeding, had dared to imagine that proximity might kindle genuine feeling between them. As the waltz concluded, they were approached by Lord Reginald Ashford, a man whose reputation for gossip was matched only by his talent for social manipulation. His pale eyes glittered with barely concealed malice as he bowed elaborately. "Your Grace, what a triumph this evening represents," he said, his voice carrying just far enough to attract nearby attention, "though I confess myself curious about certain arrangements that preceded this blessed union." Alexander's expression remained neutral, but Evangeline felt his arm tense beneath her gloved hand. "I'm afraid I don't follow your meaning, Ashford." "Oh, merely the fascinating speed with which this match was concluded," Lord Ashford continued, his smile sharp as a blade. 6 months from introduction to Walter. Quite remarkable efficiency, wouldn't you agree? One might almost suspect there were compelling circumstances that necessitated such haste. The implication hung in the air like poison gas. Around them, conversations gradually quieted as guests strained to hear the exchange. Evangeline felt heat rise in her cheeks as she realized the direction of Lord Ashford's insinuation. He was suggesting that their hasty marriage had been necessitated by scandal, specifically that she had been compromised and required a quick wedding to preserve her reputation. "Lord Ashford," Alexander's voice carried a warning that would have silenced a wiser man. "I suggest you choose your next words with considerable care." But Lord Ashford, emboldened by the attention he had garnered, pressed forward with reckless abandon. "Forgive me, Your Grace, but surely you cannot blame society for its curiosity. When a duke of your standing abandons the London season to marry a relative unknown from the provinces with such unprecedented speed, questions naturally arise about the circumstances that might have motivated such urgency." The ballroom had grown unnaturally quiet, the orchestra's music seeming to fade into the background as the drama unfolded. Evangeline felt as though she were drowning in the weight of hundreds of stares, each gaze carrying its own judgment and speculation. The careful composure she had maintained throughout the evening began to crack under the pressure of public scrutiny. "Perhaps," Lord Ashford continued with venomous satisfaction, "the new Duchess might enlighten us about the nature of her prior acquaintance with His Grace. Surely there's no shame in admitting that love occasionally transcends the boundaries of propriety." The accusation was clear, and its implications devastating. In a society where a woman's reputation was more fragile than spun glass, Lord Ashford was essentially suggesting that Evangeline had engaged in improper conduct that had forced Alexander's hand in marriage. The whispers that had begun as curious murmurs now carried the sharp edge of scandal. Alexander stepped forward, his face a mask of controlled fury. "Lord Ashford, you will apologize to my wife immediately, or you will answer to me at dawn." The challenge of a duel sent a ripple of shock through the assembled guests. Dueling, while technically illegal, remained a matter of honor among the aristocracy, and Alexander's willingness to risk his life over the insult spoke to the gravity of the offense. But the damage had been done. Evangeline could see it in the faces surrounding them, the raised eyebrows, the knowing looks, the whispered conversations that would spread like wildfire through London's social circles. By tomorrow, every drawing room in England would be buzzing with speculation about the true nature of her marriage to the Duke. Lord Ashford, perhaps realizing he had pushed too far, offered a perfunctory bow. "I meant no offence, Your Grace. Merely the idle curiosity of an old friend." As he melted back into the crowd, Evangeline found herself standing in the center of a social catastrophe that would define her reputation for years to come. The golden cage of her new life had just become a prison of public scrutiny and whispered accusations. What would her wedding night reveal about the man she had married, and would Alexander's protection extend beyond the public eye to the private chambers where their true relationship would be tested? The heavy oak door of the ducal chambers closed with a finality that seemed to echo through Evangeline's very soul. The wedding guests had finally departed, their carriages disappearing into the misty October night, but the whispers and speculative glances lingered in her memory like unwelcome phantoms. She stood in the center of the opulent room, still wearing her wedding gown, feeling more alone than she had ever felt in her 22 years of life. Alexander had excused himself immediately after the last guest departed, citing urgent estate business that required his attention. The excuse felt hollow, a transparent attempt to avoid the intimacy that their wedding night traditionally demanded. Evangeline understood with painful clarity that he was as reluctant to consummate their marriage as she was terrified of the prospect. Her lady's maid, Sarah, worked silently to remove the countless pearl buttons that adorned the back of her gown. Each button that came undone seemed to strip away another layer of the illusion that this marriage might somehow transform into something resembling happiness. The ivory silk pooled at her feet like discarded dreams, leaving her standing in her chemise and corset, vulnerable and exposed in ways that had nothing to do with her state of undress. "Shall I prepare your nightgown, Your Grace?" Sarah asked softly, her voice carefully neutral. The young woman had served the Ashworth family for years and understood the delicate nature of aristocratic marriages, particularly those arranged for political and financial advantage rather than affection. Evangeline nodded, moving to the window that overlooked Thornfield's extensive gardens. The moon cast silver shadows across the manicured lawns, creating a landscape that appeared both beautiful and eerily desolate. Somewhere in this vast manor, her husband was avoiding her, perhaps already regretting the union that had bound them together in the eyes of God and society. The nightgown Sarah selected was a masterpiece of French craftsmanship, silk so fine it seemed to float rather than fall, adorned with delicate lace that had been handmade by nuns in a Parisian convent. It was a garment designed to please a husband, to transform a bride into an object of desire and devotion. Yet as Evangeline allowed herself to be dressed in this symbol of marital intimacy, she felt more like a sacrifice being prepared for an unwilling altar. Hours passed, with agonizing slowness. Evangeline sat in the window seat, watching the shadows shift across the gardens as clouds drifted past the moon. She had dismissed Sarah, preferring solitude to the awkward presence of a servant who undoubtedly understood the situation better than she cared to acknowledge. The fire in the hearth had burned low, casting dancing shadows that seemed to mock her romantic expectations. It was nearly midnight when she heard Alexander's footsteps in the corridor outside. They paused at the door, and she could almost feel his internal struggle through the heavy wood that separated them. When he finally entered, his movements were careful and deliberate, like a man approaching a dangerous animal that might bolt at any sudden motion. He had changed from his formal evening wear into a burgundy dressing gown that emphasized the breadth of his shoulders and the aristocratic bearing that had been bred into him across generations. His dark hair was slightly disheveled, suggesting that he had been running his hands through it, a gesture she had observed during their brief courtship whenever he was particularly troubled. "Evangeline," he said quietly, her name sounding strange and formal on his lips. "I trust you found the evening manageable, despite Lord Ashford's unfortunate commentary." She turned from the window, studying his face in the firelight. There was something in his expression that she couldn't quite decipher. Regret, perhaps, or resignation. "It was educational," she replied carefully. "I learned a great deal about the nature of society's expectations and the price of failing to meet them." Alexander moved closer, but maintained a respectful distance that spoke volumes about his intentions. "I want you to understand that Lord Ashford's insinuations were entirely without foundation. Your reputation remains intact, regardless of his poisonous speculation." "Does it?" Evangeline asked, rising from the window seat. "Or have I simply traded one form of scrutiny for another? I'm no longer Lady Evangeline Ashworth, whose every action was measured against the expectations of an earl's daughter. Now, I am the Duchess of Ravenshollow, whose every breath will be analyzed for signs of unworthiness or scandal." The honesty in her voice seemed to surprise him. Throughout their courtship, she had been the picture of demure compliance, agreeing to every arrangement with gracious acceptance. This glimpse of her true thoughts, her intelligence, and her capacity for independent analysis revealed depths he had not suspected. "You speak as though you've given the matter considerable thought," he observed, settling into the chair opposite her window seat. The distance between them felt both necessary and tragic, a physical manifestation of the emotional chasm that separated them. "I have had little else to occupy my mind," Evangeline admitted. "From the moment our engagement was announced, I have been studying the role I am expected to play. The perfect duchess, the ornamental wife, the silent partner in a union designed to benefit everyone except the two people actually living it." Alexander was quiet for a long moment, his grey eyes reflecting the dying firelight. When he spoke, His voice carried a weariness that made him seem older than his 28 years. "I did not choose this marriage any more than you did, Evangeline. But I am not so naive as to believe that duty and desire often align in our world. And yet," she said softly, "I cannot help but wonder what might have been possible if we had been given the opportunity to know each other before binding our lives together. Perhaps we might have discovered some foundation for genuine affection, or at least mutual respect." The vulnerability in her admission hung between them like a bridge neither was quite ready to cross. Alexander studied her face, seeing perhaps for the first time the woman behind the carefully constructed facade of aristocratic propriety. Her beauty was indeed more subtle than striking, but there was an intelligence in her eyes and a strength in her bearing that suggested depths he had never bothered to explore. "It is not too late for mutual respect," he said finally, "though I confess I am uncertain how to proceed. The expectations surrounding our marital duties seem to complicate any attempt at genuine acquaintance." Evangeline felt heat rise in her cheeks at his oblique reference to the physical intimacy that society expected them to consummate. She had been educated about such matters in the vaguest possible terms, leaving her with more questions than answers about what their wedding night should entail. "Perhaps," she suggested with careful deliberation, "we might consider an unconventional approach to our conventional marriage. What if we were to postpone the physical aspects of our union until we have had time to develop some measure of understanding between us?" The proposal was radical by the standards of their society, where consummation was expected to occur immediately following the wedding ceremony. Yet Alexander found himself intrigued by her suggestion, recognizing in it a wisdom that their parents' generation had never possessed. "You would be willing to risk the gossip that such a delay might generate?" he asked. "Society expects evidence of our compatibility to manifest itself in due course." "Society has already begun to gossip," Evangeline replied with a bitter smile. "Lord Ashford has ensured that our marriage will be scrutinized, regardless of our actions. Perhaps it is time we stopped living our lives according to the expectations of people who care nothing for our happiness." As the fire crackled in the hearth and the clock chimed midnight, Alexander found himself seeing his new wife with fresh eyes. Her proposal suggested a courage and independence of thought that challenged everything he had assumed about her character. But could two strangers, bound by duty and circumstance, truly learn to care for each other when the entire weight of aristocratic society pressed down upon their shoulders? And what would happen when the time came to transform their tentative understanding into the intimate partnership that their marriage ultimately required? 3 months had passed since that pivotal wedding night conversation, and the unconventional arrangement between Alexander and Evangeline had begun to bear unexpected fruit. The winter months at Thornfield Manor had provided them with a sanctuary away from London's prying eyes, allowing their relationship to develop along lines neither had anticipated when they first spoke their vows. Their days had fallen into a rhythm that defied the typical patterns of aristocratic marriage. They breakfasted together each morning, discussing estate matters with a frankness that would have shocked their peers. Evangeline had proven herself to possess a sharp mind for business, offering insights about the textile operations that complemented Alexander's agricultural expertise. Their conversations, initially stilted and formal, had gradually evolved into genuine exchanges of ideas and opinions. In the evenings, they often retreated to the library, where Alexander would read aloud from works of literature, while Evangeline worked on her correspondence or embroidery. These quiet hours had become precious to both of them, offering glimpses of the companionship that might have developed naturally had they been given the luxury of courtship rather than arrangement. Yet beneath this growing friendship lay an undercurrent of tension that neither could entirely ignore. They were, after all, husband and wife in the eyes of the law and society, and the physical distance they maintained grew more difficult to sustain with each passing day. Alexander found himself increasingly aware of Evangeline's grace as she moved through their shared spaces, while she caught herself studying the strong lines of his profile when she thought he wasn't looking. The delicate balance of their arrangement was about to be tested by their return to London society. The spring season demanded their presence at countless social obligations, and the whispers that had begun at their wedding reception had only grown more persistent during their absence from the capital. Lady Catherine Pemberton, one of London's most influential hostesses, had extended an invitation to her annual spring ball, an event that would mark Alexander and Evangeline's first major social appearance since their wedding. The invitation arrived with a note that barely concealed its underlying challenge. Society is most eager to observe how the Duke and Duchess of Ravenshollow have settled into married life. As their carriage approached the Pemberton mansion on the appointed evening, Evangeline felt her stomach tighten with familiar anxiety. She wore a gown of deep emerald silk that complemented her auburn hair and brought out the green flecks in her hazel eyes. Alexander had commissioned the dress from London's finest modiste, and when she had appeared at the top of the staircase that evening, she had seen something flicker in his expression that made her pulse quicken. "Remember," Alexander said quietly as their carriage joined the queue of vehicles, depositing guests at the mansion's entrance. "We need only stay long enough to make our presence known. If the evening becomes uncomfortable, we can plead fatigue and retire early." Evangeline nodded, grateful for his consideration. Over the past months, she had come to appreciate the protective instincts that lay beneath his aristocratic reserve. He had shielded her from the worst of the gossip by limiting their social engagements and carefully controlling the information that reached the outside world about their private life. The Pemberton ballroom was ablaze with candlelight and filled with the cream of London society. As Alexander and Evangeline made their entrance, conversations paused and heads turned in their direction. The scrutiny was immediate and intense, every detail of their appearance and interaction subject to analysis by eyes trained to detect the slightest hint of scandal or discord. "Your Grace," Lady Pemberton swept forward with practiced grace, her smile bright and predatory. "How absolutely divine to see you both looking so well-suited to each other. Marriage clearly agrees with you." The emphasis on well-suited carried layers of meaning that weren't lost on either Alexander or Evangeline. They had learned to decode the subtle language of aristocratic society, where every compliment concealed a potential barb, and every observation served multiple purposes. As they moved through the crowd, accepting congratulations and deflecting subtle inquiries about their domestic arrangements, Evangeline became aware of a familiar figure approaching through the throng of guests. Lord Reginald Ashford, the man whose poisonous insinuations had cast a shadow over their wedding reception, advanced with the confidence of a predator who had spotted vulnerable prey. "Your Grace," he bowed elaborately to Evangeline, his pale eyes glittering with malicious amusement. "How radiant you appear this evening. The country air has clearly been beneficial to your constitution." Alexander stepped closer to his wife, his presence a silent warning that Evangeline appreciated even as she prepared to handle the encounter herself. The months at Thornfield had given her time to develop her own strategies for dealing with society's more unpleasant elements. "Lord Ashford," she replied with cool politeness, "how kind of you to notice. I find that happiness has a remarkably restorative effect on one's appearance." The word happiness was deliberately chosen, a direct challenge to the narrative Ashford had attempted to construct about their marriage. If he wished to suggest that their union was born of scandal rather than choice, she would counter with evidence of contentment that would undermine his malicious speculation. "Happiness, indeed," Ashford mused, his tone suggesting that he found the concept amusing, "though I confess myself curious about the nature of such happiness. Some marriages, after all, find their contentment in rather unconventional arrangements." The implication was clear and deeply insulting. Ashford was suggesting that their marriage existed in name only, that they had failed to achieve the intimate connection that society expected between husband and wife. In a world where a woman's value was often measured by her ability to provide heirs, such an accusation could be devastating to Evangeline's reputation. Before Alexander could respond with the fury that was clearly building in his expression, Evangeline surprised them both by laughing, a sound of genuine amusement that carried clearly through the surrounding conversations. "How fascinating that you should concern yourself with the private arrangements of others, Lord Ashford," she said, her voice carrying just enough volume to attract the attention of nearby guests. "I had not realized that your own domestic situation provided so little satisfaction that you must seek entertainment in speculating about ours." The counterattack was perfectly executed, turning Ashford's own weapon against him. His marriage to Lady Margaret Ashford was notoriously unhappy, a union that had produced no children despite 15 years of matrimony. By drawing attention to his own failures, Evangeline had effectively neutralized his ability to criticize theirs. Ashford's face flushed with anger, but before he could formulate a response, another voice cut through the tension with smooth authority. "Lord Ashford, surely you have more pressing matters to discuss than the obvious happiness of the Duke and Duchess." The speaker was Lord James Whitmore, a man whose reputation for integrity and diplomatic skill had made him one of London's most respected figures. His intervention carried weight that even Ashford couldn't ignore, and his public support of Alexander and Evangeline would be noted by every gossip in the room. "Lord Whitmore," Ashford managed through gritted teeth, "I was merely expressing my interest in the welfare of old friends." "How thoughtful," Whitmore replied dryly, "though I believe your attention might be better directed toward your own affairs. I understand Lady Margaret has been quite vocal about certain disappointments in her domestic arrangements." The threat was subtle, but unmistakable. Whitmore was suggesting that he possessed information about Ashford's private life that could prove embarrassing if made public. In the delicate ecosystem of aristocratic society, such knowledge was a powerful weapon. Ashford retreated with as much dignity as he could muster, but the damage to his credibility had been done. The guests who had witnessed the exchange would spread word of his humiliation, effectively ending his ability to spread malicious gossip about the Ravens Hollow marriage. As the evening progressed, Alexander found himself watching his wife with growing admiration. She moved through the social minefield with grace and intelligence, deflecting criticism and building alliances with a skill that rivaled his own. The shy, retiring girl he had married was revealing herself to be a woman of considerable strength and strategic thinking. During a brief moment when they found themselves alone on a secluded balcony, Alexander turned to Evangeline with an expression she had never seen before, one of genuine respect and something that might have been the beginning of deeper feeling. "You were magnificent tonight," he said quietly. "I had not realized the extent of your capabilities in such situations." Evangeline felt warmth spread through her chest at his praise. "I have had an excellent teacher," she replied. "Watching you navigate these social waters has been quite educational." They stood in comfortable silence for a moment, the sounds of the ball drifting through the open doors behind them. The spring air carried the scent of blooming flowers from the garden below, and the moonlight cast silver shadows across the terrace. "Evangeline," Alexander said suddenly, his voice carrying a note of uncertainty that was entirely unlike his usual confident demeanor. "I find myself wondering if our arrangement might be ready for evolution." The words hung between them, loaded with implications that made Evangeline's heart race. After months of careful friendship and growing respect, was he suggesting that they might finally explore the physical intimacy that their marriage had always promised but never delivered? But what would such a step mean for two people who had built their relationship on intellectual compatibility rather than passion, and could desire truly flourish in soil that had been prepared by duty rather than love? The carriage ride back to their London townhouse passed in contemplative silence. Both, Alexander and Evangeline, lost in thoughts, sparked by their successful navigation of the evening's social challenges. The gas lamps lining the streets cast flickering shadows through the carriage windows, creating an intimate atmosphere that seemed to amplify the tension that had been building between them for months. Alexander's suggestion on the balcony had left Evangeline's mind racing with possibilities and fears in equal measure. The careful friendship they had cultivated felt precious and fragile, something that could be either strengthened or shattered by the introduction of physical intimacy. Yet she could not deny that her feelings toward her husband had evolved far beyond the dutiful respect she had initially expected to feel. As their carriage pulled up to the elegant Georgian townhouse that served as their London residence, Alexander handed her down with the same careful courtesy he had shown since their wedding night. But now his touch lingered a moment longer than necessary, and she found herself acutely aware of the warmth of his fingers through her gloves. "Evangeline," he said as they stood in the marble foyer, the servants having retired for the evening. Would you join me in the library for a moment? There are matters I believe we should discuss." She nodded, her heart beating faster as she followed him into the book-lined sanctuary that had become their favorite retreat. Alexander moved to the sideboard and poured 2 glasses of sherry, his movements betraying a nervousness that was entirely unlike his usual composed demeanor. "Tonight," he began, handing her a glass, "I watched you handle Lord Ashford's provocations with a skill that would have impressed the most seasoned diplomat. You have grown into your role as Duchess with a grace that has exceeded every expectation I might have held." Evangeline accepted the compliment with a slight inclination of her head, but she sensed that his words were leading toward something more significant. "You speak as though you are surprised by my capabilities." "I am," he admitted with startling honesty. "When we married, I saw you forgive me, as a necessary acquisition, a well-bred young woman who would fulfill the social requirements of my position while bringing financial advantages to my estate. I did not expect to discover a partner whose intelligence and strength would challenge and inspire me." The admission hung between them like a bridge neither was certain they were ready to cross. Evangeline set down her sherry glass and moved to the window that overlooked their private garden, needing the distance to process the implications of his words. "And now?" she asked quietly. "What do you see when you look at me now?" Alexander joined her at the window, standing close enough that she could feel the warmth radiating from his body. "Now I see a woman I have come to care for deeply. A woman whose happiness has become important to me in ways I never anticipated." The word care carried weight in the careful language of their class, suggesting feelings that went beyond mere respect or affection. Evangeline turned to face him, studying his expression in the moonlight that streamed through the tall windows. "Alexander," she said, using his given name with an intimacy that had developed gradually over their months together. "What are you asking of me?" He reached out slowly, giving her time to withdraw if she chose, and gently cupped her face in his hands. "I am asking if you might be willing to allow our marriage to become what it was always meant to be. Not merely a union of convenience, but a true partnership in every sense." The question was delicately phrased, but its meaning was unmistakable. After months of careful restraint, he was asking if she was ready to consummate their marriage, not out of duty or social expectation, but from genuine desire and growing affection. Evangeline felt her breath catch as she looked into his grey eyes, seeing there a vulnerability that he rarely allowed anyone to witness. The man who commanded respect in Parliament and managed vast estates with unwavering confidence was asking for her permission to become her husband in the most intimate sense. She began, then paused, gathering her courage. "I find myself caring for you as well, Alexander, more than I ever expected to care for anyone, but I must confess that I am inexperienced in such matters. I fear disappointing you." The admission of her innocence, though hardly surprising given her sheltered upbringing, seemed to affect him profoundly. His thumbs traced gentle circles on her cheekbones as he considered his response. "Evangeline," he said softly, "you could never disappoint me. If you are willing to trust me, I promise to be patient, to be gentle. We need not rush toward anything that makes you uncomfortable." The tenderness in his voice, combined with the careful way he held her face, dissolved the last of her reservations. She had spent months learning to trust this man with her thoughts, her fears, her dreams for their future. Now she found herself ready to trust him with her body as well. "Yes," she whispered, the single word carrying the weight of decision that would transform their relationship forever. "Yes, I am willing." Alexander's response was immediate and reverent. He leaned down slowly, giving her time to change her mind, before pressing his lips to hers in a kiss that was both gentle and filled with months of suppressed longing. Evangeline had been kissed before, brief, stolen moments during her debut season, but nothing had prepared her for the warmth and tenderness of her husband's embrace. When they finally broke apart, both were breathing unsteadily. Alexander rested his forehead against hers, his hands still framing her face with careful reverence. "Are you certain?" he asked, his voice rough with emotion. "We can wait longer if you need more time." "I am certain," she replied, surprised by the steadiness of her own voice. "I want to be your wife in every way, Alexander. I want to discover what we might become together." He took her hand and led her from the library, up the grand staircase to the ducal chambers they had shared in name only for the past months. The room had been prepared for the evening, with candles casting warm light across the elegant furnishings and a fire crackling in the hearth. Alexander paused at the threshold, suddenly uncertain despite his years of experience. This was different from any encounter he had known before. This was his wife, a woman he had come to respect and care for, a woman whose trust he was determined to honor. "Evangeline," he said, turning to face her in the candlelight, "I want you to know that whatever happens between us tonight, it changes nothing of the respect and affection I have developed for you. You are not merely fulfilling a duty, you are choosing to share yourself with me, and I am honored by that choice." The formal words carried deep emotion, and Evangeline felt tears prick her eyes at the sincerity in his voice. This was not the cold transaction she had feared on their wedding night, but something approaching the romantic dreams she had harbored as a young girl. As Alexander began to help her with the fastenings of her gown, his movements were slow and careful, giving her time to adjust to each new intimacy. When the emerald silk pooled at her feet, leaving her in her chemise and corset, she felt vulnerable, but not afraid. The months of growing trust between them had created a foundation that made this moment feel natural rather than forced. "You are beautiful," Alexander murmured, his voice filled with wonder as though he were seeing her for the first time. "So very beautiful." The reverence in his tone made Evangeline feel cherished rather than merely desired. As he continued to undress her with patient gentleness, she found herself relaxing into his touch, trusting him to guide her through this new territory. When she stood before him in only her chemise, Alexander paused, his eyes meeting hers in the candlelight. "Are you still certain?" he asked one final time. "Yes," she breathed, reaching up to begin unfastening his shirt. "I am certain." What followed was a revelation for both of them. Alexander's experience, combined with his genuine care for Evangeline's comfort and pleasure, transformed what could have been a painful duty into something approaching transcendence. He was patient beyond measure, taking time to ensure her readiness, whispering words of encouragement and affection as he guided her through each new sensation. For Evangeline, the experience was both overwhelming and wonderful. The physical intimacy was unlike anything she had imagined, but it was the emotional connection, the sense of complete trust and growing love, that truly took her breath away. In Alexander's arms, she felt not like a possession or a duty, but like a cherished partner in something sacred and profound. Afterward, as they lay entwined in the candlelight, Both were quiet with the magnitude of what had passed between them. The careful friendship they had built had been transformed into something deeper and more complex, a true marriage in every sense of the word. "Evangeline," Alexander said softly, his fingers tracing patterns on her bare shoulder, "I need you to know that what we have shared tonight, it was not merely physical for me. I believe I am falling in love with you." The confession, spoken into the intimate darkness, made Evangeline's heart soar with joy she had never dared to hope for. "And I with you," she whispered back, turning in his arms to face him. "I love you, Alexander, truly and completely." As they held each other in the aftermath of their newfound intimacy, both understood that their marriage had been transformed from a union of convenience into something far more precious and rare. But would their love be strong enough to withstand the challenges that lay ahead, and what new trials would test the bond they had forged in the sanctuary of their private chambers? 6 months had passed since that transformative night in their London townhouse, and the change in Alexander and Evangeline's relationship had been nothing short of miraculous. What had begun as a marriage of convenience had blossomed into a love story that defied every cynical expectation of their aristocratic world. The whispers that had once threatened to destroy Evangeline's reputation had been replaced by admiring observations about the obvious devotion between the Duke and Duchess of Ravenshollow. The summer sun streamed through the tall windows of Thornfield Manor's morning room as Evangeline sat at her writing desk, responding to the mountain of correspondence that had accumulated since their return from London. Her hand moved gracefully across the cream-colored stationery, accepting invitations, declining others, and managing the complex social obligations that came with her elevated position. But there was a lightness to her movements now, a confidence that had been absent during those first uncertain months of marriage. Alexander entered the room carrying a leather portfolio filled with estate documents, but his attention was immediately drawn to his wife's radiant appearance. The morning light caught the auburn highlights in her hair, which she wore in a softer style than the rigid fashions demanded by London society. Her dress of pale yellow muslin complemented her complexion and emphasized the gentle curves that had become so familiar and beloved to him. "Good morning, my dear," he said, crossing to place a gentle kiss on the top of her head, a gesture of casual intimacy that would have been unthinkable during their early days together. "I trust you slept well?" Evangeline looked up from her correspondence with a smile that transformed her entire face. "Very well, thank you. Though I confess I missed your presence when I woke. Estate business called you away early this morning?" "The new irrigation system for the eastern fields required my attention," Alexander explained, settling into the chair beside her desk rather than retreating to his own study, as he might have done in the past. "But I find myself increasingly reluctant to spend time away from your company, even for such practical matters." And the easy affection between them was evident in every glance and gesture. What had once been careful politeness had evolved into genuine partnership, with each supporting and complementing the other in ways that strengthened both their public roles and their private happiness. "Speaking of company," Evangeline said, setting down her pen, "I've received a most interesting letter from Lady Whitmore. She's organizing a charitable committee to establish schools for the children of factory workers, and she's requested my participation as patroness." Alexander raised an eyebrow, intrigued by the proposition. "That's quite progressive of Lady Whitmore. Such an endeavor would certainly attract attention, both positive and negative. Are you interested in accepting?" "Very much so," Evangeline replied with enthusiasm that surprised him. "I've been thinking a great deal about the responsibilities that come with our position. We have been blessed with wealth and influence. Surely we have an obligation to use those advantages for the betterment of others." The passion in her voice revealed depths of social consciousness that Alexander was still discovering. His wife was not content to simply play the ornamental role that many duchesses embraced. She wanted to make a meaningful difference in the world around them. The work would be demanding, he cautioned, though his tone suggested support rather than discouragement. You would be dealing with government officials, factory owners, and social reformers, not all of whom would welcome a duchess's involvement in such matters. Then perhaps it's time they learned to welcome it, Evangeline replied, with a spark of determination that made Alexander's heart swell with pride. I may have been born to privilege, but that doesn't mean I'm blind to the suffering of those less fortunate. If our position gives me the power to help, then I intend to use it. Alexander reached across to take her hand, marveling at how this woman continued to surprise and inspire him. Then you shall have my complete support in this endeavor. The Raven's Hollow name carries considerable weight in political circles. We'll use every bit of that influence to advance your cause. The conversation was interrupted by the arrival of Pemberton, who entered with his usual dignified bearing, but carrying an expression of barely concealed excitement. Your Grace, he addressed Alexander with formal precision, Lord Ashford has arrived and requests an audience. He appears somewhat agitated. Alexander and Evangeline exchanged glances, both remembering their last encounter with the man who had attempted to destroy their reputation. What could possibly bring him to Thornfield Manor, particularly in a state of agitation? Show him to the blue drawing room, Alexander instructed. We'll receive him there momentarily. As Pemberton withdrew, Evangeline felt a familiar flutter of anxiety. Despite the strength she had developed over the past months, encounters with Lord Ashford still had the power to unsettle her. The man seemed to take perverse pleasure in creating discomfort for others. Whatever he wants, Alexander said, sensing her unease, remember that he no longer has any power to harm us. Our marriage has proven itself to society, and his credibility was thoroughly destroyed at the Pemberton ball. They made their way to the drawing room, where they found Lord Ashford pacing before the fireplace like a caged animal. His usually immaculate appearance was dishevelled, his cravat askew, and his hair showing signs of agitated running of fingers through it. When he turned to face them, his pale eyes held a desperation that was almost pitiful. Your Grace, he said, bowing with less than his usual elaborate ceremony. Thank you for receiving me. I find myself in need of assistance, and you are perhaps the only person in England with both the power and the magnanimity to help me. The admission clearly cost him dearly. This was a man who had built his reputation on superiority and condescension, now reduced to begging for help from the very people he had attempted to humiliate. Please sit, Evangeline said graciously, her natural compassion overriding her personal dislike for the man. Tell us what troubles you. Ashford perched on the edge of a chair, his hands trembling slightly as he struggled to compose himself. It's my son, he said finally. My eldest boy, Charles. He's been accused of embezzling funds from his regiment. The scandal will destroy not only his career, but our entire family's reputation. Alexander leaned back in his chair, studying Ashford with calculating eyes. And you believe we can help you how exactly? Your influence with the War Office, Ashford said desperately. A word from the Duke of Raven's Hollow could ensure that the matter is handled quietly, without the public disgrace that would otherwise follow. I'm prepared to offer substantial compensation for such intervention. The irony of the situation was not lost on any of them. The man who had attempted to destroy their marriage through public humiliation was now begging them to save his family from the same fate. Evangeline looked at her husband, seeing the internal struggle playing out across his features. Alexander had every right to refuse Ashford's request, to allow the man's family to suffer the consequences of their actions just as he had tried to make them suffer. But she also knew the man she had married, beneath his aristocratic reserve, lay a fundamental sense of justice and compassion. Lord Ashford, Alexander said finally, his voice carefully neutral, your request puts me in a difficult position. You have shown little regard for the reputation and happiness of others in the past. Why should I extend to you the courtesy you denied to us? Ashford's face crumpled with shame and desperation. Because you are a better man than I am, Your Grace. Because you have the strength of character that I have always lacked. I know I don't deserve your help, but my son, he's young. He made a mistake. Please don't let my failures destroy his future. The plea was genuine, stripped of the arrogance and malice that had characterized all their previous interactions. For the first time, Evangeline saw Lord Ashford not as a villain, but as a flawed, frightened father trying to protect his child. "Alexander," she said quietly, her voice carrying the weight of gentle suggestion rather than demand, "perhaps this is an opportunity to demonstrate the kind of leadership our position should represent. Not revenge, but justice, tempered with mercy." Alexander studied his wife's face, seeing there the compassion and wisdom that had made him fall in love with her. She was right, of course. True nobility lay not in the ability to destroy one's enemies, but in the strength to show mercy when it was least expected. "Very well," he said, turning back to Ashford. "I will make inquiries about your son's situation. If the charges are, as you describe, a young man's error rather than deliberate criminality, I will use my influence to ensure he receives fair treatment. But I want your word that this marks the end of your interference in the lives of others. No more gossip, no more malicious speculation, no more attempts to destroy reputations for your own entertainment." Ashford nodded eagerly, tears of relief streaming down his face. "You have my word, Your Grace, my solemn oath. I will never again. I am deeply ashamed of my past behavior, and I swear to you that it will not be repeated." Irene, as they concluded the interview, and Ashford departed with profuse expressions of gratitude, Alexander and Evangeline found themselves alone in the drawing room, processing what had just occurred. "You were right to encourage mercy," Alexander said, taking his wife's hand. "I confess my first instinct was to refuse him entirely, but your compassion reminded me of who I want to be, who we want to be together." Evangeline squeezed his hand, her heart full of love for this man who continued to grow and evolve before her eyes. "We have been given so much, Alexander. Love, position, influence, happiness beyond what either of us dared to hope for. How can we not share those blessings with others, even those who have wronged us?" As the afternoon sun slanted through the windows of Thornfield Manor, Alexander and Evangeline sat together in comfortable silence, contemplating the strange turns their life had taken. What had begun as a marriage of convenience had become a love story that would be whispered about in drawing rooms for generations, not as scandal, but as proof that even the most unlikely unions could bloom into something beautiful when tended with patience, respect, and genuine affection. Their future stretched before them, bright with possibility and purpose. Together, they would use their position to make a difference in the world, supporting causes that mattered and showing mercy to those who needed it most. They had learned that true nobility lay not in the accident of birth, but in the choices one made when faced with the opportunity to lift others up or tear them down. In choosing love over duty, compassion over revenge, and partnership over dominance, Alexander and Evangeline had discovered that the greatest treasures in life were not inherited, but earned through the courage to be vulnerable, the wisdom to forgive, and the strength to build something beautiful from the most unpromising beginnings. Their love story would endure not because it was perfect, but because it was real, a testament to the transformative power of two hearts willing to take the risk of truly knowing and cherishing each other. If you've been captivated by Alexander and Evangeline's journey from strangers to soulmates, don't forget to subscribe to our channel for more stories of love, redemption, and the triumph of the human heart. Share this tale with someone who believes in the power of second chances and true love, and let us know in the comments which moment in their story touched you most deeply. Until next time, remember that the greatest love stories are often found in the most unexpected places.